This is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and military operations depicted are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. This story is not affiliated with or endorsed by the U.S. Navy or Department of Defense. The dog stopped mid-stride. Nash Calloway noticed immediately. After 4 years of training alongside Storm, he could read the German Shepherd the way he once read terrain maps in hostile country. Every shift in posture, every twitch of ear, every change in breathing told him something. And right now, Storm was telling him something was wrong. They were 60 yards from the barn on Nash's 15-acre property outside of Pine Fall, Washington, running a nighttime search and rescue drill in the October rain. The training mannequin was hidden a quarter-mile south behind a deadfall Nash had scouted that afternoon. Storm had been tracking clean, nose low, methodical, exactly the way Nash had trained him. 4-year-old German Shepherd, blackened tan coat, soaped dark, working with the focused drive that made him one of the strongest SAR prospects in the county volunteer program. Then he stopped. Storm's ears rotated forward. His head came up. The rain was steady, cold, tapping against the hoods of the pines and running in thin streams down Nash's jacket collar. Storm stood rigid, facing northeast, the opposite direction of the mannequin. "Fuss," Nash said. "Heel. Come back." Storm didn't move. Nash frowned. In 4 years, Storm had never refused a command. Not once. The dog had been selected from a breeding program that supplied law enforcement across the Pacific Northwest. He'd arrived at Nash's ranch at 14 months old with solid nerves, excellent drive, and an eagerness to please that bordered on obsession. Disobedience wasn't in his vocabulary. Storm. Fuss. The dog's shoulders dropped. His nose pushed toward the ground, swept left, swept right. Then he looked back at Nash. A long, direct stare. The kind he gave when he'd located a training target. But the mannequin was south. Storm was pointing northeast, into the deep timber. Nash's hand tightened on the flashlight. Old instinct. When the situation changes, stop talking and start observing. 20 years in the teams had burned that into his nervous system until it lived there like a second heartbeat. He scanned the tree line. Rain blurred the shapes of the Douglas firs into a dark wall. No light. No sound beyond the water on the leaves. Storm broke into a run. "Storm!" The dog vanished into the timber, a dark shape dissolving into darker shapes. Nash cursed under his breath and went after him. The ground turned from packed gravel to soft forest floor, needles and mud giving under his boots. Rain hit his face. Branches whipped at his arms. The flashlight beam bounced wildly through the trees, catching flashes of Storm's wet coat 20 yards ahead. Then 30. Then just a suggestion of movement deep in the pines. Nash ran. His left knee barked on every downhill step, a grinding reminder of too many fast ropes and hard landings. He ignored it. Storm had never done this. Something in those woods had pulled the dog off a trained exercise with a certainty that Nash recognized. The certainty of a working dog who had found a real target. They ran for nearly 20 minutes. Nash tracked Storm by sound, the crash of paws through underbrush, the occasional crack of a branch. The forest thickened. The pines grew taller, closer together, their canopy shutting out what little light the overcast sky offered. Nash's breathing was controlled but heavy. Rain soaked through his jacket to the thermal beneath. Then Storm stopped. Nash nearly ran into him. The dog stood at the edge of a small clearing, stock still, ears up, tail low. Ahead, barely visible through the rain, a structure, a cabin. Old timber frame, maybe 12 by 16, with a corrugated metal roof patched in 2 places. The single window on the near side was covered, plywood nailed over the frame from the outside. No light leaked from the edges. A padlock hung from the door hasp, old but functional. Storm whined, low, controlled. He took 2 steps toward the cabin and sat down, facing the door. Nash swept the clearing with his flashlight. No vehicle, no fresh tire tracks, though the rain would have washed them within hours. A rusted propane tank sat against the far wall. A length of chain was coiled near the door frame, one end bolted to the cabin's foundation. Then he heard it, a sound from inside, so faint it barely registered above the rain. A tapping, irregular, weak, like knuckles against wood from someone who had been knocking for a very long time and no longer expected an answer. Nash's right hand tightened on the flashlight. His shoulders drew up. For one breath, just one, something locked in his chest. A sound he hadn't heard in 3 years tried to surface. Radio static. A voice. He pushed it down, his jaw set. He crossed to the door in 4 strides and examined the padlock. Standard combination, commercial grade. He pulled the multi-tool from his jacket pocket, selected the flathead, and worked the hasp screws out of the wet wood in under a minute. The door swung inward. The smell hit him first. Damp fabric, unwashed skin, stale air, chemical toilet, canned food. The beam of his flashlight cut through the dark interior and found a cot against the far wall, a plastic bucket, 3 cases of bottled water with most bottles empty, and a pile of canned goods, beans, soup, tuna, stacked in a cardboard box near the door. On the floor beside the cot, a woman lay curled on her side. She was small, thin, silver hair matted against her temple. Her wrists showed bruising and rings, the kind left by restraints applied and removed repeatedly. She wore a flannel shirt 2 sizes too large and wool socks that had worn through at the toes. Her eyes were closed. Her lips were cracked. Storm walked in before Nash could stop him. The dog approached the woman slowly, head low, and lay down beside her. His body pressed against her back. He rested his chin on the floor near her shoulder and breathed. Slow, steady, warm. The woman's eyes opened. She looked at the dog first, not at Nash, not at the flashlight, at Storm. Her hand moved, shaking, slow, and touched the fur on his neck. Her fingers curled into it and held. "Good boy," she whispered. Her voice was sandpaper and dust. Nash knelt beside her. He kept the flashlight angled away from her face. His hands moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had performed field assessments under worse conditions. Pulse at the wrist, skin turgor on the back of her hand, a gentle check of her pupils when she finally looked at him. "Ma'am, my name is Nash. I'm going to get you out of here." She studied his face. Her eyes were pale blue, clear despite the dehydration, and they held an alertness that surprised him. This woman was fully present. Whatever had been done to her body, her mind was intact. "How did you find me?" she asked. Nash glanced at. He did. The woman looked at Storm again. Her cracked lips moved into something close to a smile. Smart dog. Nash checked the cabin once more. The plywood on the window was nailed from outside, confirming she couldn't have opened it herself. The padlock had been on the exterior, the chain near the foundation. Everything pointed in one direction. "Can you stand?" She nodded faintly. Nash helped her sit up, then eased her to her feet. She weighed almost nothing. He shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The October night cut through his thermal immediately, but he'd operated in worse cold with less clothing. Storm stood when she stood. The dog positioned himself on her left side, pressing gently against her leg. "I've got an ATV about 20 minutes east. Can you walk that far?" "I can try." They moved slowly through the trees. Nash kept one arm near her back without touching, ready to catch, not control. Storm walked on her opposite side, a living guardrail. The rain continued. The pines creaked above them in the wind. Halfway to the ATV, the woman spoke again. "Don't call the police." Nash looked down at her. Rain ran off his forehead and into his eyes. "Ma'am?" She stopped walking, looked up at him with those clear, fierce eyes. "He owns me. By law. If you call them, they'll give me back." Nash said nothing. He filed the words exactly where they needed to go, in the part of his mind that had spent 2 decades sorting intelligence under pressure. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. The rain was cold. The woman was hypothermic, and there would be time for answers inside walls. They reached the ATV. Nash lifted her onto the rear seat, secured the strap across her waist. Storm jumped up and positioned himself at her feet, his big frame wedged into the narrow cargo space. The dog looked at Nash once, then rested his head on the woman's knee. Nash started the engine and drove toward the lights of his ranch house. The house was warm. Nash had left the heat running before the training exercise, and the old baseboard radiators were doing their job. He brought the woman inside, sat her on the couch in the living room, and draped the wool blanket from the back of the recliner over her legs. Storm followed her every step. When she sat, he lay down at her feet and pressed his shoulder against her ankle. Nash filled a glass of water and brought it to her. Small sips. She drank carefully. Her hands shook around the glass. Nash watched her the way he watched everything, cataloging details without appearing to stare. The bruises on her wrists were 4 to 5 days old, based on the yellowing at the edges. She was dehydrated, but not critically. Her speech was clear. Her eyes tracked normally. Her cognitive function appeared strong. Malnourished, cold, frightened, but intact. He sat in the chair across from her, the one that faced both the front door and the hallway. Habit. 20 years of habits didn't retire when you did. "What's your name?" "Eleanor Marsh." "People call me Ellie." "Ellie, how long were you in that cabin?" She looked down at the water glass. 91 days. Nash's jaw tightened. 3 months. In a cabin in the woods with canned food and a bucket. "Who put you there?" "My son-in-law, Victor Tate." Nash waited. Storm's ears twitched at the name, but the dog didn't lift his head. "Victor obtained guardianship over me 11 months ago. Through a judge in the county court. A lawyer named Garrett Prine handled the paperwork." She paused, took another sip of water. "The petition stated I was mentally incapacitated, unable to care for myself, a danger to my own well-being." Her voice was quiet but precise. "None of that is true." Nash studied her. Everything he'd observed confirmed her words. Clear speech, logical sequence, accurate time tracking, appropriate emotional responses. This woman was sharp. "He sold my house," Ellie continued, 8 months ago. A home I lived in for 32 years. Sold it to a company I'd never heard of, for less than half its value. The money went into accounts I can't access. And the cabin? He rented it under a different name, told the owner he needed storage for equipment. She looked toward the window. Rain streaked the glass. "He moved me there when I threatened to contact a lawyer. That was 3 months ago." Nash leaned back in his chair. Storm shifted at Ellie's feet, rolling slightly so his back pressed against her leg. The dog's eyes were half closed, but his ears stayed up, monitoring. "You said not to call the police." Ellie nodded. "If you call them, they'll check the guardianship papers. The papers are legal. Victor is my court-appointed guardian. Under state law, he has authority over my living arrangements, my finances, my medical decisions." She met Nash's eyes. "They won't arrest him. They'll return me to his custody. And next time, he won't use a cabin 20 minutes from town." Nash said nothing for a long moment. He ran his thumb along the arm of the chair, a slow back and forth that helped him think. "You're staying here tonight." "You don't have to. You're staying here tonight, Ellie." She looked at him, then at Storm. The dog opened one eye and thumped his tail once on the hardwood floor. "All right," she said. Nash stood. He moved to the hallway closet and pulled out a pillow and a second blanket. When he returned, Storm had shifted position. The dog now lay with his body curved around Ellie's feet, his head resting on one of her wool socks. The shepherd's eyes were fully closed for the first time that night. Nash set the pillow beside her. "Guest room is down the hall. I'll make it up. The couch is fine. I've slept on worse these past 3 months." Nash paused. Something moved behind his ribs. He pushed it aside. "There's a lock on the guest room door. Inside lock. You control it." Ellie looked at him for a long time. Then her eyes filled, not spilling, just filling. And she nodded once. He helped her to the guest room. Storm followed. When Nash stepped out and pulled the door shut, he heard the lock turn. Then, through the door, the soft thump of Storm lying down on the floor beside the bed. The dog had chosen his post. Nash didn't argue. He walked back to the living room, sat in the chair facing the front door, and stayed awake until morning. Dawn came gray and cold. The rain had stopped sometime before 5, replaced by a heavy mist that turned the pines outside Nash's windows into ghost shapes. He made coffee, black, strong, in the French press his mother had given him 6 years ago, and that he'd never once used until he'd moved to Pinefall. The sound of the kettle was the only noise in the house until Storm's nails clicked on the hallway floor. The dog appeared first, then Ellie, moving slowly in the doorway, the borrowed flannel shirt hanging to her knees. She looked better with 8 hours of warmth and water. Still thin, still pale, but the sharpness in her eyes had returned fully. "Coffee?" "Please." Nash poured a second cup. Ellie sat at the kitchen table. Storm positioned himself between her chair and the door, not quite at her feet, not quite at Nash's, holding the middle ground. Nash sat across from her with his back to the wall and a clear line to both the front and kitchen doors. He drank his coffee and let the silence sit. In his experience, people talked more when you gave them space than when you gave them questions.
"Your dog found me," Ellie said after a while. "He was running a search drill. Went off course."
"Of course," she smiled faintly. "Or exactly on course." Nash set his cup down. "I need to call someone. A doctor." Ellie's hand tightened on her mug. "Not the hospital," Nash said. "A doctor I know through the SAR program. She runs the clinic in town. I trust her." "Can you trust her to keep quiet?" Nash thought about Wren Aldridge. Thought about the way she'd handled the program paperwork. Thorough, no shortcuts, but free of the institutional fussiness you found in people who'd never worked outside fluorescent-lit buildings. She'd mentioned once, offhand, that she'd served as a corpsman before medical school. Fleet Marine Force. 2 deployments. She hadn't elaborated, and he hadn't asked. "Yes." He made the call at 7. Short, direct. "I have a patient at my ranch. Elderly woman, dehydrated, possible exposure. I need you here, not at the clinic, and I need it quiet." Wren arrived in 40 minutes. She drove a mud-splashed Subaru wagon with a faded Navy Federal sticker in the corner of the rear window. Nash watched her from the porch as she parked. She moved the way he expected. Efficient, no wasted motion, eyes scanning the property once before she grabbed her medical bag and walked toward the house. Early 40s, dark hair pulled back, lean build, no jewelry. She wore a fleece over scrubs and boots that had seen actual mud, not store displays. Storm stood at Nash's side on the porch. The dog watched Wren approach with ears forward, tail neutral. When she reached the bottom step, Storm descended and sniffed her outstretched hand. His tail moved once. He stepped aside. "Inside," Nash said. Wren nodded. No small talk. He appreciated that. In the kitchen, Wren set her bag on the table and looked at Ellie. She was professional for 3 seconds. Then something shifted. "Mrs. Marsh?" Ellie looked up, Wren's hand stilled on her bag. "I examined you at the clinic 2 years ago. Routine physical. You were..." She stopped. "You were perfectly healthy. I remember you, Dr. Aldridge. Then you vanished. Your records were transferred out. I assumed you'd moved." "I didn't vanish," Ellie said quietly. "I was taken." Wren looked at Nash. He gave a slight nod. Wren sat down, opened her bag, and began the examination. Nash leaned against the kitchen counter and watched. Storm lay in the center of the room, equidistant from all 3 people, his head up, ears tracking the conversation like a radar dish. Wren worked carefully. Blood pressure, pulse ox on a portable unit, pupil response, skin check for pressure sores, range of motion in the wrists where the bruising showed. She asked Ellie to count backward from 100 by 7s. Ellie got to 30 without a mistake. "Mrs. Marsh." Wren set down her stethoscope. "You are mildly dehydrated and underweight. Your wrist contusions are consistent with repeated restraint, but your cognitive function is fully intact." She paused. "There is absolutely no medical basis for a finding of mental incapacity." "I know," Ellie said. Wren turned to Nash. Her eyes were different now, harder, focused. The professional mask had slipped, and underneath it was something Nash recognized. He'd seen it in operators who'd been given bad intel and come home carrying the weight of what happened next. "How long?" Wren asked. 3 months in the cabin. 11 months under guardianship. Wren's jaw set. She looked at Ellie again. "I had a patient 3 years ago. Ruth Delaney. 82 years old. She went into a care facility and She stopped, swallowed. I saw signs. I didn't act. She died 8 months later. The kitchen was very quiet. Storm's ears flattened, then rose again.
That wasn't your fault, Ellie said.
It was my responsibility. Wren stood. She looked at Nash. What do you need from me? Medical documentation. Everything you just found. Video, if she consents. Something that can stand up in a courtroom and prove she doesn't belong under anyone's guardianship.
Wren nodded once.
I'll need to come back with proper equipment. Tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning works. Wren packed her bag. At the door, she paused, looked back at Ellie. Mrs. Marsh, I'm sorry I didn't look harder when you disappeared. Ellie shook her head gently. You're here now. Wren left. Nash watched her taillights disappear down the gravel drive, the red blurring into the morning mist. Storm came to stand beside him on the porch, pressing against his leg. Nash looked down at the dog. You picked a hell of a night to stop following orders. Storm's tail moved once. That was enough. The guardianship papers were folded into a square no larger than a playing card. Ellie had hidden them inside her clothing when Victor moved her to the cabin. The one thing she could keep that might someday prove what had been done. Nash unfolded them at the kitchen table that afternoon, while Ellie rested in the guest room with Storm curled on the rug beside the bed. The documents were wrinkled, soft with body heat and sweat, but legible. Nash smoothed them flat and began reading. He'd spent years analyzing intelligence reports, field assessments, after-action reviews where a single detail could change the interpretation of an entire operation. He read the guardianship petition the same way, not for what it said, but for what it revealed about the people who'd written it. The petition was filed by Victor Tate and prepared by Garrett Prine, attorney at law, with an office in a neighboring county seat. The medical evaluation attached to the filing was signed by a doctor Nash had never heard of. Not Wren, not anyone from Pinefall. A doctor in another town, evaluating a patient he'd likely never examined in person. Nash pulled up Prine's name on his laptop. Public records, bar registration, court filings. It took 40 minutes of methodical searching, cross-referencing property transfers and guardianship petitions across 2 counties before the pattern emerged. Garrett Prine had filed guardianship petitions for at least 3 other elderly individuals in the past 2 years. In each case, the ward's property had been sold within months of the guardianship being granted. In each case, the sales were below market value to LLCs, with no clear ownership trail. Nash sat back. His right shoulder ached. Rotator cuff, the old injury flaring when he'd been hunched over the laptop too long. He rolled it once and kept working. This wasn't one man exploiting his mother-in-law. This was a system. Prine provided the legal mechanism. Victor, and possibly others, provided access to vulnerable people. The courts, overloaded and underfunded, rubber-stamped the paperwork, and the victims disappeared from their communities so quietly that no one asked questions. He pulled up the property sale records. Ellie's house, a 3-bedroom clapboard on a half-acre lot in Pinefall, had an assessed value of $340,000. It sold for $185,000 to Ridgeline Holdings LLC, registered in a neighboring county with no listed officers and a P.O. box for an address. Nash cross-referenced the LLC with the other guardianship cases. 2 of the 3 properties had been sold to the same entity, same lawyer,
Same LLC, same playbook.
Nash wrote the details down in a small notebook he kept in the kitchen drawer. Longhand, blue ink. Old habit from planning sessions before ops. Digital could be accessed. Ink on paper went where you put it and stayed there.
From the hallway, he heard Storm shift on the guest room rug. Then the creak of bed springs. Ellie appeared in the doorway, wrapped in the flannel shirt and a blanket. She looked at the papers spread across the table, at Nash's notebook, at the laptop screen.
"You're treating this like a mission," she said.
Nash looked at her. "It is a mission."
Ellie sat down across from him. Storm padded in and settled under the table between them. She studied the guardianship papers, her own papers, spread flat where Nash had smoothed them. Her eyes moved across the legal language slowly.
"I read those words so many times in that cabin. Ward is deemed incapacitated and unable to manage personal affairs." She touched the paper. "I can balance a checkbook, bake a pie from memory, and name every president in order. But a judge I never met signed a piece of paper, and suddenly I was property."
Storm rested his chin on Ellie's foot. The dog's eyes were open, watching. Nash said nothing for a moment. Then,
"We're going to prove that paper wrong."
he closed the laptop, looked toward the hallway. Through the half-open guest room door, he could see Storm's tail, dark fur on the pale rug.
Nash picked up his phone and called a number he hadn't dialed in 8 months. It rang 3 times. "Calloway, it's been a while." The voice on the other end belonged to a man Nash had served with for 6 years, a former teammate who'd gone into federal work after leaving the teams. Their conversations were always brief and always useful.
"I need you to run a name. Garrett Prine, attorney in Washington State. I think he's running an elder fraud operation through the guardianship system."
"That's a specific accusation. I've got a victim sitting in my guest room, with bruises on her wrists and guardianship papers signed by a doctor who doesn't exist at the address listed on the filing." Silence on the line. Then, "Give me 48 hours. Copy." Nash ended the call. He stared at the phone for a moment, then set it face down on the table. In the guest room, Storm sighed in his sleep, a deep, contented exhale that filled the quiet house. The next morning, Nash drove into Pinefall. The town sat in a shallow valley between 2 ridges of Douglas fir, population just under 3,000, with a main street that ran 6 blocks and held a grocery, a hardware store, a diner called the Pine Box, named with the kind of dark humor that only a logging town could sustain, and Wren's Clinic in a converted 2-story brick building that had once been a dentist's office. Nash parked on the main street and walked Storm on a loose lead. The dog drew looks, he always did. A 90-pound German shepherd with a working dog's build and an alert, intelligent face wasn't something people ignored. Nash used the attention. People talked to the dog, and while they talked to the dog, Nash talked to them. The postmaster, a balding man named Loomis, who'd run the office for 18 years, leaned over the counter when Nash mentioned Ellie's name. "Marsh? Eleanor Marsh?" Loomis scratched his chin. "Sure, I remember her. She moved, didn't she? Year and a half ago?" "Moved where?" I'm not sure anyone said exactly. One day the mail hold went in, and that was that." "Who requested the hold?" Loomis blinked. "I'd have to check. Privacy rules, you know." Nash nodded. Didn't push. He'd gotten what he needed. The mail had been stopped. Someone had done that using Ellie's name.
or more likely, using guardianship authority. Outside, Storm pulled on the lead. The dog's ears were up, his attention fixed on a pickup truck parked at the far end of the street. Dark green, older model, mud on the wheel wells. No one inside. Storm's chest vibrated with a low growl. "Easy," Nash said quietly. He memorized the plate number without appearing to look at it. The truck didn't belong to anyone he'd seen in Pinefall before. He filed it. At the diner, he bought coffee and sat near the window where he could see both the street and the door. The waitress, a woman in her 50s named Carolyn, brought his cup without being asked. He'd been coming in twice a week since spring. "Carolyn, you remember an older woman, Eleanor Marsh? Used to live on the east side of town?" Carolyn's smile dimmed. "Ellie? Oh, sure, sweet woman. Always ordered the turkey club with no tomato." She wiped the counter. I think she moved to be closer to her daughter? Or maybe it was a care home. Did she say goodbye? Carolyn stopped wiping. No. Now that you mention it, she just stopped coming in. Nash drank his coffee. Across the street, the green pickup was gone. He walked past the hardware store and stopped at the bench outside the library. An older man sat there, feeding pigeons from a bag of stale bread. Nash didn't know his name, but had seen him before. Every town had one. The man who sat and watched and remembered. "Excuse me, did you know Eleanor Marsh?" The man looked up. His eyes moved to Storm first, then to Nash. Something crossed his face. Recognition, or maybe reluctance. "Ellie Marsh." He tore a piece of bread slowly. "Yeah, used to walk past here every morning. 8 o'clock, like clockwork. Had a blue raincoat she wore all winter." When did she stop? The man tossed bread to the pigeons. "Year ago, maybe more. I asked Carolyn at the diner about it. She said Ellie moved." He paused, looked at Nash sideways. Didn't feel right, though. Ellie loved this town. 30 years she lived here. You don't just leave without telling the man who feeds the pigeons. Nash waited. Someone came around after she left. Asked the regulars not to worry. Said the family was handling things. The old man shrugged. So, we stopped worrying. Who came around? The man's jaw worked. He looked at the pigeons. "Fella I didn't recognize. Big shoulders. Drove a green truck." Storm's ears flicked at the words. Nash filed that too. He walked Storm 2 blocks east to the neighborhood Ellie had described. The house was easy to find. White clapboard, maple tree in the front yard. But the porch chairs were gone. The yard had been cleared down to bare grass. A realtor's lockbox hung from the front door handle, and the windows were dark. Storm sniffed the base of the maple tree. His tail dropped. The dog circled the tree once, then sat and looked at Nash with an expression that was hard to name, but impossible to misread. Something had lived here. It was gone. A woman emerged from the house next door, gray-haired, mid-60s, wearing a quilted vest over flannel. She stopped when she saw Nash and the dog. "Can I help you?" "Just walking the dog. Did you know the woman who lived here?" The woman's arms folded across her chest. "I knew Ellie. We used to garden together on weekends." She looked at the dark house. Her son-in-law came by one day and said she was going to a facility in Seattle. Said it was what Ellie wanted. A pause. "But Ellie never said goodbye to me. Not once." 9 years we were neighbors. That bother you? It kept me up at night for a week.
She unfolded her arms. Then I told myself it wasn't my business. She looked at Nash directly. Was I wrong? Nash held her gaze. I'll be in touch. He handed her a card from the SAR program with his phone number. She took it without looking away. Storm pressed against Nash's leg as they walked back toward the main street. The dog's posture had shifted. More alert, ears tracking, the way he moved when he sensed Nash's mood changing. At the clinic, Ren was between patients. She met him in the small office upstairs where she kept her files. The room was organized with military neatness. Binders in rows, labels facing out. Desk clear, except for a laptop and a coffee mug with a caduceus on it. I pulled Ellie's file from 2 years ago, Ren said. She turned her monitor toward Nash. Full physical, blood work, cognitive screening, everything clean. Then, 6 months later, someone submitted a records transfer request. Her entire file was forwarded to a clinic in Tacoma. Did Ellie request the transfer? The request form is signed by her guardian. Nash leaned forward. Prine. The signature reads V. Tate, court-appointed guardian, with the guardianship order number attached. Ren's voice was flat, controlled, the kind of control that came from long practice. I didn't flag it. Transfer requests come through all the time. I had no reason to think. You couldn't have known. Maybe not. She closed the file. But I should have asked. Nash stood. Storm waited by the office door, tail still, ears up. The dog had been watching the street through the stairwell window since they'd arrived. I'm going to need that video evaluation tomorrow. And I need you to document everything. The bruising, the dehydration, the conditions I found her in. Photos, measurements, your clinical assessment. All of it admissible. I'll have it ready. Nash turned to go. At the door, he stopped. Ren. She looked up. The woman who died, Ruth Delaney. Was her guardianship handled by Garrett Prine? Ren's face went still. I don't know. I never checked. Check. He walked downstairs with Storm at his heel. Outside, the mist had burned off and pale October sunshine fell on the main street. The green pickup was nowhere in sight. Nash walked to his truck, loaded Storm into the cab, and sat for a moment behind the wheel. The town of Pinefall looked quiet. Clean storefronts, an American flag outside the post office, a church steeple visible above the tree line at the end of the street. A town where people knew each other's names and ordered the turkey club with no tomato. A town where an old woman had disappeared and no one had asked why. Nash started the engine. Back at the ranch, he found Ellie at the kitchen table. She'd made tea, chamomile, from a box Nash had forgotten was in the cupboard. Storm lay under the table with his head on her foot. The dog's tail moved when Nash walked in, but he didn't get up. Nash set his keys on the counter. People in town remember you, but someone told them not to ask questions. Ellie nodded slowly. She didn't seem surprised.
Nash pulled out his laptop and sat across from her. He'd found something during his research the day before and hadn't shown her yet. He turned the screen toward her now.
A real estate listing. Her house. The photograph showed a white clapboard home with a maple tree in the front yard, a porch with 2 rocking chairs, a kitchen with yellow curtains. Listed as sold 8 months prior for $185,000 to Ridgeline Holdings, LLC. Ellie stared at the screen. Her hand found Storm's head under the table and held. That's my sewing room. She pointed at a window on the second floor.
Her finger trembled. I made curtains for every room in that house. David, my husband, he said I spent more on fabric than most people spend on furniture. A pause. He proposed to me in that kitchen 44 years ago. He burned the roast because he was so nervous, and we ate peanut butter sandwiches instead.
Storm shifted under the table, pressing closer against her legs. The dog's eyes were open, watching her face. Ellie closed the laptop gently. Her hands were steady now. I didn't cry when they took me to the cabin. I didn't cry when Victor sold the house. But I cried when I realized no one in this town noticed I was gone. Nash's jaw tightened. He thought about the postmaster who'd filed a mail hold without asking, the waitress who'd assumed Ellie moved, the man on the bench who'd stopped worrying because someone in a green truck told him to. They notice now. Ellie looked at him. Then she nodded once. A small, tired gesture that carried more weight than words. Later, as the afternoon faded, Ellie went to the back porch. Nash watched from the kitchen window as she sat in the Adirondack chair with a blanket around her shoulders, facing the timber. Storm followed her out and settled beside the chair, his big head resting on his paws. Nash dried the dishes and put them away. He checked the guest room lock twice. He walked the perimeter of the house the way he'd walked perimeters around forward operating bases, not because he expected contact, but because the walking itself was a kind of thinking. When he came back around to the porch, Ellie was speaking. Not to him, to Storm, or to the trees, or to something Nash couldn't see. I prayed every night in that cabin, she said. Her voice was steady, unhurried. Not for rescue. I stopped expecting that after the first month. She stroked Storm's ears slowly. I prayed that someone would know I was still here, that I hadn't just evaporated, that somewhere, in some record, in some memory, Eleanor Marsh still existed. Storm rose from his spot and rested his chin on her knee. Ellie placed her hand on his head. The October light was failing, turning the mist above the pines from silver to gold to gray. And then your dog came through the door. Nash stood at the corner of the house, one hand on the post, and said nothing. There was nothing to say that would be worth more than the silence. After a while, he went inside and turned on the porch light. He'd been leaving it off since he moved in 18 months ago. No visitors expected. No reason to signal that anyone was home. A dark porch suited a man who preferred not to be found. Tonight he left the light on, and when he passed the guest room door on his way to bed, he heard Storm's breathing through the wood. Slow, deep, steady. And the faint sound of Ellie humming something he didn't recognize. A hymn, maybe, or a lullaby. Something from a house with yellow curtains and a maple tree in the yard. Nash sat in his chair in the living room, facing the front door, and waited for whatever was coming next. Whatever was coming next arrived on the third morning. Nash was in the barn running Storm through a scent discrimination exercise. 3 identical boxes, one loaded with a cotton pad carrying a stranger's scent, the other 2 clean. Storm hit the correct box on the first pass, sat, looked back. Nash tossed him a rubber Kong. Good boy. Storm caught the toy midair and trotted back to reset position. The barn smelled of sawdust, old hay, and the faint metallic tang of the tools Nash kept on a pegboard near the door. Morning light slanted through the gaps in the siding,
falling in pale stripes across the concrete floor. Then Storm dropped the Kong. The dog's head snapped toward the barn entrance. His ears went rigid. A low vibration built in his chest, deeper than his alert growl, the one Nash had learned to take seriously. Nash heard it a second later. Tires on gravel, not the sound of Ren's Subaru. This was heavier, a truck, coming slow. He moved to the barn door and looked toward the house. A pickup had pulled into the ranch driveway. Green, older model, mud on the wheel wells. The same truck Storm had growled at on the main street in Pinefall 2 days ago. The engine shut off. A man stepped out. He was broad through the shoulders, early 50s, with a thick brown beard and a build earned by years of physical work rather than a gym. He wore a canvas jacket over a flannel shirt, work boots, and a cap with a faded hunting outfitter logo. His hands hung loose at his sides. He looked around the property with the slow, deliberate attention of someone memorizing the layout. Nash stepped out of the barn. Storm came with him, positioned slightly ahead and to the left, the working dog equivalent of taking point. The growl in Storm's chest hadn't stopped. "Help you?" Nash said. The man turned. His eyes moved from Nash to Storm and back. A smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mornin'. Name's Boyd. Heard you run some kind of dog training program out here." SAR, volunteer program. Not open to the public. Boyd nodded as though Nash had confirmed something he already knew. He took a step toward the house. Storm's growl sharpened. "I wouldn't," Nash said. Boyd stopped. He looked at the dog. Friendly animal. When he wants to be. Boyd's eyes drifted past Nash, toward the ranch house. The kitchen curtain moved. Ellie, watching from inside. "Nice property," Boyd said. "Lot of acreage. Dogs running around out here. Hope they stay on your side of the tree line." He adjusted his cap. Things happen in these woods. Nash said nothing. He stood with his weight centered, hands at his sides, shoulders square. He'd spent 20 years reading men under pressure, in briefing rooms, across interrogation tables, through rifle scopes. Boyd was not a sophisticated operator. He was muscle sent to deliver a message and gauge a reaction. The question was, whose muscle? Anything else? Boyd held Nash's gaze for 3 seconds. Then he shrugged, turned, and walked back to his truck. He paused at the door. "Pretty country up here. Shame if somebody's dogs got into trouble on the wrong land." He drove away. Nash watched the truck disappear down the gravel road. Storm stood rigid beside him until the sound of the engine faded entirely. Then the dog sat, looked up at Nash, and exhaled, a sharp huff through his nose. "Yeah," Nash said. "I know." He pulled his phone from his pocket and photographed the tire tracks Boyd's truck had left in the damp gravel. Then he went inside. Ellie stood at the kitchen counter, both hands wrapped around a mug of tea. Her face was pale but composed. "That was one of Victor's people." "You know him?" She shook her head. "I don't know his name, but I've seen him before. He came to the cabin twice to bring supplies. He never spoke to me, just left the boxes inside the door and locked it again." Nash filed that. Boyd had direct contact with the cabin. That made him a witness, or an accessory. "He's not the threat, Ellie. He's the scout." She looked at him. "When someone sends a scout, it means they already know your position. The real question is what they do next." Ellie set down her mug. "Victor knows I'm here." "Yes." "What does that mean?" Nash looked at Storm.
The dog had followed him inside and was sitting by the kitchen door, watching the driveway through the window. Ears up. Alert. Waiting.
It means we don't have as much time as I thought.
That evening, Wren returned to the ranch with her medical equipment. A proper video camera, digital blood pressure cuff, portable scale, and a cognitive assessment kit she'd pulled from the clinic's supply room. She set up in the living room while Nash made coffee. Storm lay on the rug between the camera and Ellie's chair, facing Wren. The dog seemed to understand that something important was happening. His posture was calm but alert, the same way he sat during official SAR evaluations. Wren was thorough. The video evaluation ran 40 minutes. She walked Ellie through the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, verbal fluency tests, clock drawing, delayed recall. Ellie scored 29 out of 30, missing only 1 point on the serial subtraction, and catching her own error before Wren could note it. Mrs. Marsh, for the record. Wren looked directly at the camera. Your cognitive function is well within normal range for your age group. You demonstrate intact memory, executive function, language processing, and visuospatial skills. In my professional medical opinion, there is no clinical basis for a determination of mental incapacity. Thank you, Ellie said quietly. Wren turned off the camera. She sat back and rubbed her eyes. The light in the room had shifted from afternoon gold to the blue-gray of early evening. Rain had started again, tapping on the roof in a rhythm that had become the soundtrack of this October. Nash brought coffee to both of them. He sat in his chair, the one facing the door, and watched Wren pack her equipment. Her movements were precise but slower now, the way people moved when they were processing something that went beyond professional obligation. You check on Ruth Delaney's guardianship? Wren stopped packing. Yes. And Garrett Prine. She said the name like she was placing a pin in a map. He filed the petition. Same format, same attached physician's evaluation, same physician, a Dr. Harold Keene, who lists a practice address that corresponds to a vacant office suite in Olympia. Nash leaned forward. Same doctor who signed Ellie's evaluation. Same doctor, same address, same signature. Wren's jaw was set. Ruth Delaney's house was sold 4 months after guardianship was granted, below market, to Ridgeline Holdings, LLC. The room was quiet, except for the rain and Storm's steady breathing. How many more? Ellie asked from her chair. Wren looked at her. I don't know, but I'm going to find out. Nash stood. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark driveway. The gravel was dark with rain. No tire tracks except Wren's Subaru. He scanned the tree line by habit, left to right, slow, the way he'd scanned 1,000 perimeters in a dozen countries. Clear. Storm raised his head and watched him. The dog had a sense for when Nash's attention shifted from domestic to operational. Ears came up, eyes sharpened. Even lying on the rug with his head on an old woman's foot, the shepherd was ready. We need to move faster. Boyd's visit means Victor knows Ellie is here. He'll either try legal action to reclaim custody, or he'll try something less official. Wren frowned. Legal action would expose him. If he goes to court, we present the video, the medical assessment, the property records. He won't go to court. Nash turned from the window. A man who rents a cabin under a false name and chains a woman's foundation to the wall doesn't want a courtroom. He'll try to move her before anyone can file. Ellie's hand found Storm's head. The dog pressed against her leg. He'll come for me, she said. It wasn't a question.
Nash looked at her. Not while you're in this house.
Ellie held his gaze. Then she looked down at Storm. This dog of yours. He found me. In the dark. In the rain. Through a locked door. She stroked behind his ears. Storm's eyes closed. I spent 91 days asking God if anyone was coming. And the answer walked in on 4 legs and lay down beside me before the man with the flashlight even got through the door. Wren's eyes glistened. She turned away toward her bag. Nash said nothing, but he noticed that his right hand had unclenched, and he couldn't remember when he'd made a fist. Outside, the rain intensified. It hit the roof in sheets now, and the pines beyond the yard swayed and creaked. Somewhere in the timber, a branch cracked and fell. Storm's ears tracked the sound, then dismissed it. Known threat. Irrelevant. Nash walked Wren to her car. They stood in the rain for a moment, neither moving toward the driver's door. I'll file the state AG paperwork tomorrow, Wren said, and I'll keep digging on Prine's other cases. Good. And Wren, she looked at him. Watch your mirrors when you drive home. She nodded, got in the car, drove away into the rain. Nash stood in the driveway until the taillights disappeared. Storm had followed him out, and now sat on the wet gravel, rain flattening his coat, watching the same empty road. Inside, Nash said. Storm shook the water off his coat in a spray that caught Nash across the chest. The dog trotted to the porch and waited. Nash followed. At the door, he paused and looked back at the dark tree line one more time. Assessed. Clear. For now. The next afternoon, Wren called from the clinic. Nash, I just got a call from a woman named Abigail Tate. She says she's Eleanor Marsh's daughter. Nash was on the back porch, watching Storm work a tracking exercise across the south field. The dog was 100 yards out, nose down, moving with purpose. Nash straightened. What did she say? She's looking for her mother. She said her husband, Victor, told her Eleanor was in an assisted living facility in Seattle. She called the facility. Wren paused. They've never heard of Eleanor Marsh. Nash closed his eyes, opened them. Where is Abigail now? She's at a motel in Redmond. She wants to come to Pinefall. Nash, she sounded scared. Bring her here, tomorrow morning, to the ranch. You understand what this means, Wren said. Victor didn't just hide Ellie from the world. He hid her from her own daughter. I'll pick Abigail up at the bus station. She can't drive. She has MS. Nash ended the call. He stood on the porch for a long time, watching Storm work the field. The dog reached the end of the scent trail, sat, and looked back at Nash across the distance, waiting for the next command. Nash thought about Abigail Tate, a woman with multiple sclerosis, married to a man who had imprisoned her mother and lied about it to her face. If Victor went down, Abigail would lose her husband, the person who drove her to appointments, managed the house, helped her on days when her legs didn't cooperate. She would have to choose between the truth about her mother and the stability of her own daily survival. That was the kind of decision Nash understood. He'd made versions of it in rooms with maps on the walls and lives on the line. The right call and the easy call were almost never the same call. Storm. Here. The dog broke into a run, covering the 100 yards in smooth, ground-eating strides. He arrived at Nash's feet, tongue out, eyes bright. Good boy. Nash scratched behind Storm's ears. The dog leaned into his hand. Abigail Tate arrived the following morning in Wren's Subaru. Nash watched from the kitchen window as Wren helped her out of the passenger side. Abigail was younger than he'd expected, early 40s, with Ellie's pale blue eyes and a thin frame that listed slightly to one side. She used a cane. Her free hand gripped Wren's forearm as they crossed the gravel. Ellie stood in the living room doorway. She had dressed carefully, a clean sweater Nash had found in a donation box at the hardware store, her hair brushed, her posture straight. She looked like a woman preparing for the most important meeting of her life. Storm sat beside Ellie. His tail was low, his ears forward, reading the room. Wren opened the front door. Abigail stepped inside and saw her mother. Neither woman moved. The distance between them was 8 feet, but it held 11 months of silence, lies, and a cabin in the woods. The rain outside was steady. The clock on the living room wall ticked. Storm broke the distance. The dog stood, walked to Abigail, and stopped in front of her. He lowered his head and pressed his nose against the back of her hand, the one resting on the cane. A gentle pressure, an introduction. Abigail looked down at the dog. Her chin trembled. "Mom?" "I'm here, sweetheart." Abigail's cane clattered to the floor. She covered the 8 feet in 3 unsteady steps, and Ellie caught her. The older woman's arms wrapped around her daughter with a strength that didn't match her frame. The kind of strength that comes from waiting, from counting days, from hearing your own heartbeat in a locked room and wondering if you'll hear your daughter's voice again. Storm backed away. He circled behind Nash and sat down at the edge of the room, giving the 2 women space the way a working dog gives a handler room to operate. His eyes stayed on them, amber and steady. Abigail's legs gave slightly. Ellie held her up. "I've got you." "Mom?" Abigail's voice broke on the single syllable. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." "Of course you didn't. That's why he chose this." They stood like that for a long time. Nash counted 60 seconds by habit, then stopped counting. Some things weren't meant to be measured. Nash and Wren stepped onto the porch. The door was still open. Through it, they could hear the sound of 2 women holding each other. The kind of crying that comes from a place so deep it doesn't need words. Storm walked out of the house after a few minutes, past Nash and Wren, and sat at the edge of the porch. He watched the driveway, guarding, giving the 2 women inside the room they needed. Nash leaned against the porch rail. Wren stood beside him. For a long time, neither spoke. The rain fell on the pine trees and ran off the roof in thin curtains. "Last time I saw something like this," Wren said, "I didn't do anything." Nash looked at her. "A patient told me her family was making decisions she didn't agree with. Financial things. Moving her out of her home." Wren stared at the rain. "I documented it, filed a note, and then I went to my next appointment." "Ruth Delaney." "Yeah." Nash said nothing. He knew the weight she was carrying. It was the same shape as his, different details, same architecture. A moment where you could have acted and didn't. A cost someone else paid. "You're here now." Wren turned her head. Her eyes met his. Dark brown, steady, carrying something that might have been gratitude, or might have been the first thread of something more complicated. "So are you." They stood like that for a few seconds longer than necessary. Then Wren looked away and Nash became very interested in the texture of the porch railing. Storm's tail thumped once on the floorboards. Inside, the conversation took 2 hours. Nash let Ellie tell her own story. He sat in his chair, quiet, while Ellie walked Abigail through the timeline. The guardianship petition, the house sale, the cabin, the 91 days. She spoke clearly, without self-pity, laying out facts the way Nash would have laid out a briefing. Abigail listened. Her face cycled through stages Nash recognized from debriefs after bad ops. Disbelief, then anger, then the sick realization that the person you trusted had been operating against you the whole time. "He told me you wanted to go," Abigail whispered. "He said the facility in Seattle had a garden. He said you loved the garden." "There was no garden, sweetheart." Ellie held her daughter's hand. "There was no facility." Abigail stared at the floor. Storm had returned inside and now lay between the two women, his body stretched across the rug, his head near Abigail's foot. He hadn't been commanded to be there. He'd chosen the position. "I need to call him," Abigail said suddenly. Nash's eyes sharpened. "Not yet." Abigail looked at him. "He's my husband. I need to hear him." "If you call him right now, he'll know where your mother is. He'll know you know. And he'll have time to plan." Nash kept his voice level. "We need him to believe everything is normal for as long as possible." Abigail's mouth opened, closed. She looked at Ren. "He's right," Ren said gently. "If Victor feels cornered, he could try to move your mother again, or destroy records. We need the evidence intact." Abigail's grip tightened on her cane. Then she exhaled, long, shaking. "Okay, but I need to do something. I can't just sit here." Nash leaned forward. "There is something. When you're ready, not today, maybe tomorrow, call Victor. Act normal. Ask about your mother. Let him lie. And record the conversation." Abigail blinked. "Record it?" Washington is a 2-party consent state for recordings. But a spouse documenting conversations about a family member's welfare for legal proceedings falls under specific exceptions when there's reasonable suspicion of fraud. Nash paused. "Your mother is sitting next to you with bruises on her wrists. That's reasonable suspicion." Ren looked at Nash with an expression he couldn't quite read. Respect, maybe. Or surprise at how precisely a man who trained dogs for a living could cite state recording law. Nash didn't explain. There were things he'd learned in 20 years of naval special warfare that had nothing to do with combat. Intelligence gathering was one. Understanding the legal frameworks that protected the people doing the gathering was another. Abigail nodded slowly. "Tomorrow. I'll call him tomorrow." Ellie squeezed her daughter's hand. Storm's tail moved against the rug. Abigail stayed at the small motel on the edge of Pinefall. Ren drove her back that evening. Nash walked them to the Subaru, Storm at his heel. At the car, Abigail turned. She looked at Nash. Really looked. The way people did when they were deciding whether to trust someone with something that could break them. "Why are you doing this?" Nash considered the question. The honest answer was complicated. The short answer was simpler. "Because your mother knocked on a door, and my dog heard it." Abigail stared at him. Then she got into the car. Ren lingered by the driver's side. The evening air was cold, and her breath made small clouds that dissolved into the dark. "That was a good answer." "It was the true one," Ren smiled. "Brief, barely there, gone before Nash could be sure he'd seen it. She got in the car and drove away. Nash stood in the driveway until the taillights vanished around the curve. Storm pressed against his leg. The night was quiet. No wind, no traffic, just the drip of rain off the pines and the distant hoot of an owl in the timber. He went inside. Ellie was already in the guest room. Through the door, he could hear her voice, low, steady, talking to Storm, who had taken his post beside the bed again.
"You found me," Ellie was saying, "and then you found my girl. What else are you going to find,
Storm's tail thumped against the rug. Nash walked to the kitchen. He opened his laptop and checked his email. Nothing from his contact at the federal agency yet. The 48 hours were almost up. He closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen. Through the window, the porch light made a yellow circle on the wet gravel. Beyond it, the pines were black columns against a blacker sky. His phone buzzed. Text from Wren, Ruth Delaney's guardianship. Filed by Garrett Prine. Property sold to Ridgeline Holdings, LLC. Same pattern. Same everything. Nash read the message twice. Then he typed back 2 words. How many? 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. I'm checking. It might be more than we thought. Nash set the phone down. He looked at the porch light burning in the window. 2 days ago, he'd been training a dog to find mannequins in the woods. Now, he was building a case against a guardianship fraud ring with a doctor who carried guilt like a second bag. An old woman who'd survived 3 months in a cabin on canned beans and prayer, and a daughter who was about to record her own husband lying. He'd run missions with worse odds and fewer assets. In the guest room, Storm sighed. The sound carried through the quiet house. Warm, steady, alive. Somewhere in the timber, the owl called again. Nash turned off the kitchen light, but left the porch light on. He'd leave it on until this was done. The next evening, Wren stayed late. She'd come to the ranch after clinic hours with updated documentation, photographs of Ellie's wrists taken with proper forensic lighting, a written clinical narrative, and a USB drive containing the video evaluation. She spread everything across the kitchen table while Nash cooked. He hadn't intended to cook for anyone. The meal was supposed to be for himself. Eggs, toast, food you made when eating was a task and not an event. But Ellie had gone to bed early, tired from the reunion with Abigail, and Storm had followed her to the guest room. The house was quiet in a way that felt less empty than usual. Wren looked up from the documents. "You cook?" "I heat things until they're edible." That's what my instructors at Coronado would have called a minimally acceptable standard. Nash glanced at her. It was the first time she'd referenced their shared background directly. He cracked 2 more eggs into the pan. "You trained at Coronado?" "FMTB West. Corpsman Pipeline before the fleet." She didn't elaborate. She picked up her coffee mug, the same one she'd used the last 3 visits, always the blue one with the chipped handle. Nash had noticed. He slid a plate across the counter. Wren accepted it. They ate standing because the table was covered in evidence. "I was HM2 when I got out," she said. "Fleet Marine Force. 2 deployments. Helmand, then the Horn." Nash stopped chewing. "Helmand. Yeah. Bad place. Bad year." She set down her fork. "I spent 14 months putting people back together. Then I came home and realized I needed to put myself back together. And nobody was offering to help with that part." Nash looked at her. He recognized the architecture of what she was saying, the structure behind the words. Two veterans in a kitchen, talking around the center of their damage the way planets orbit a star. Close enough to feel the gravity. Far enough to keep moving.
So you went to medical school.
GI Bill. 4 years of classrooms after 4 years of trauma bays. She picked her fork back up. The professors kept saying, the patient presents with, and I kept thinking, the patient presents with a face that reminds me of Corporal Reyes. But you learn to separate.
Do you?
Ren looked at him. No, but you learn to function inside the not separating. Nash almost smiled. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in months. Maybe longer. They finished eating. Nash reached across to take Ren's plate. Their hands met on the ceramic edge. Not a touch exactly. A proximity. Ren's fingers were still for a half second. Then she pulled back and reached for her coffee. Nash took the plate to the sink. More coffee? I should go. Early morning. She packed the evidence copies into her bag. At the door, she zipped her fleece and looked back at the kitchen. The light fell across the table. The documents, Nash's notebook, the 2 coffee mugs still sitting where they'd left them.
Your kitchen isn't too quiet tonight.
Nash leaned against the doorframe. No, it isn't. Ren nodded once. Then she walked to her car. Nash watched from the door. Storm had appeared from the hallway. Nash hadn't heard him leave the guest room, and now stood beside Nash, pressing against his leg. Nash looked down at the dog. Don't. Storm's tail moved once. The 48 hours passed. On the morning of the 4th day since Ellie's rescue, Nash's phone rang at 6:15. His contact's voice was clipped and careful, the tone of someone speaking from a room where conversations were documented. Garrett Prine is already on a watch list. FBI Elder Fraud Task Force out of Portland has an open file. They've been building for 8 months, but they're short on victim testimony and clean medical evidence. Nash stood at the kitchen window. The October dawn was gray. Storm sat beside him, watching a pair of ravens argue in the maple tree at the edge of the yard. I've got both. A victim with full cognitive capacity, documented by a licensed physician, video, photos, property records linking Prine to at least 4 guardianship cases through the same LLC. Silence. Then, file through the state attorney general. I'll make sure it reaches the right desk at the bureau. But Nash, this is going to take time. They'll want to build the federal case properly. Could be weeks before they move. We might not have weeks. Then you'll need to keep your witness safe until they're ready. Nash ended the call. He looked at Storm. The dog looked back. 48 hours for an answer. Weeks for action. He scratched Storm behind the ear. That's the difference between operators and bureaucrats. Storm sneezed. Nash chose to interpret that as agreement. At 10 that morning, Abigail called Victor. She sat in Ren's clinic. The upstairs office, door closed, Ren's phone recording the conversation on speaker. Nash stood by the window, arms crossed, listening. Storm lay at Abigail's feet. The dog had positioned himself there the moment she sat down, and nobody had questioned it. Abigail's hands shook as she dialed. She held the cane across her lap. Her face was pale, but set. The phone rang 4 times. Hey, Abs. Victor's voice filled the small room. Easy. Warm. The voice of a man who believed he was speaking to someone who didn't know anything. Hi. I was just thinking about Mom. Have you visited her lately? Last week. She's doing great. They've got this new physical therapy program she's really into. She sends her love. Abigail closed her eyes. Her grip on the cane turned her knuckles white. Storm pressed harder against her ankle. That's good. Does she like the room? Loves it. South-facing windows. She can see the garden from bed. Nash watched Abigail's face. Every lie was a blade, and she was taking them without flinching. He'd seen operators do this in hostile environments. Absorb the deception, store the intelligence, keep the asset talking. Victor, I was thinking of visiting her. Maybe next week? A shift in Victor's tone. Barely perceptible. Next week's not great, actually. They're doing renovations on her floor. Might be better to wait until after the holidays. The holidays are 2 months away. I just want to make sure it's a good experience for you. You know how travel is, with your legs. Abigail opened her eyes. She looked at Nash. He gave a single nod. Okay, I'll wait. She paused. Love you. Love you too, Abs. Get some rest. The call ended. Abigail set the phone on the desk. Her hand was still shaking. He didn't even hesitate, she said. The garden, the therapy program. He made it all up in real time, and his voice didn't change. Nash uncrossed his arms. That's useful. That recording proves he's actively maintaining a false narrative about your mother's whereabouts. Combined with the medical evidence and property records, it's enough. Wren stepped forward and gently placed her hand on Abigail's shoulder. You did great. Abigail shook her head. I didn't do great. I sat in a room and listened to my husband lie about where my mother has been for a year. She looked down at Storm. The dog's amber eyes looked back up at her. How do you trust someone after that? Nobody answered. Some questions didn't have answers that fit inside a sentence. Storm licked Abigail's hand once. She let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and rested her fingers on his head. That afternoon, Boyd returned to Pinefall. Not to the ranch, to Wren's clinic. Wren called Nash at 2:15. Her voice was controlled but tight. There's a green pickup parked across the street from my clinic. The driver has been sitting there for 40 minutes. He's watching my front door. Nash was at the ranch with Ellie and Storm. He'd been reviewing the evidence file on his laptop, organizing the documents into a sequence that a state attorney could follow. Don't leave the clinic. I'm coming. He loaded Storm into the truck and drove to town in 12 minutes. He parked 1 block from the clinic, leashed Storm, and walked. The green pickup was exactly where Wren had described. Boyd sat behind the wheel, window down, arm hanging out. He saw Nash coming and didn't move. Didn't start the engine. Just watched. Nash walked directly to the truck. He didn't break stride. Didn't hesitate. He stopped at the driver's window and placed his open hand flat on the roof. Firm, controlled, a gesture neither violent nor polite. 2 knocks. Metal rang under his palm. Boyd looked up at him. Nash said nothing. He held Boyd's eyes with the steady, unblinking focus of a man who had spent hundreds of hours behind optics, watching, waiting, choosing the moment. His jaw was set. His breathing was even. Storm stood at his left side, absolutely still, not growling, because Nash had not asked him to, and the silence was more effective than sound. 10 seconds passed. Boyd started the truck. He pulled out of the parking space without speaking, drove to the end of the block, and turned left. Gone. Nash watched the truck disappear. Then he walked to the clinic entrance. Wren stood inside the glass door, arms crossed. What was that?
A conversation.
You didn't say a word.
Didn't need to.
Wren looked at him. Something moved across her face. Relief, maybe. Or the recognition that the man standing in front of her had lived inside a world where silence carried more authority than shouting.
He wasn't there for me, she said.
No, he was there so Victor knows where you are, which means Victor knows where you're not.
Nash paused. He's not watching the ranch right now. He's watching the people who leave it.
Wren's expression shifted. You think he's going to try to take Ellie?
Nash looked out the clinic window. The main street was empty. The American flag outside the post office moved in a light wind.
Not today, but soon. He's mapping the pattern. When I leave, when you visit, how long Ellie's alone. He turned back to Wren. I need to break the pattern.
How?
By being unpredictable, which is the one thing a man like Victor can't plan for.
Nash called Storm. The dog was already at the door, watching the empty street where the green truck had been.
Fuss.
Storm fell into position at his left heel. They walked out of the clinic and into the October afternoon. The sky had cleared to a hard blue, the kind that comes between storms in the Pacific Northwest. Temporary, sharp, a reminder that the weather here never stayed the same for long. Back at the ranch, Nash moved through the property with purpose. He checked the sight lines from every window. He noted which doors locked from the inside, which ones had deadbolts, which ones a determined man could kick through in under 5 seconds. The guest room door, solid core brass lock, would hold. The kitchen door, hollow core, chain latch, would not. He drove to the hardware store and bought a deadbolt for the kitchen door and a battery-powered motion sensor for the driveway. The clerk, an older man with reading glasses on a chain, rang him up without comment. Small town. People didn't ask why a man was buying a deadbolt on a Thursday afternoon. At home, Nash installed the deadbolt in 20 minutes. The motion sensor took another 10. He tested both. Storm watched from the kitchen floor, head on his paws, tracking Nash's movements with patient attention. When Ellie came out of the guest room for dinner, she noticed the new hardware on the kitchen door. She said nothing, but she looked at Nash, and he saw in her face something he recognized. The expression of a person realizing they are no longer alone in their fight.
Smells like soup, she said.
Chicken noodle. From a can.
My favorite kind. She sat at the table. Storm moved to his position between her chair and the door.
They ate in comfortable silence. Outside, the motion sensor light blinked once as a deer crossed the edge of the driveway and disappeared into the timber. After dinner, Nash sat at the kitchen table with his notebook. He wrote 2 lists. The first was evidence they had: medical evaluation, video recording, property records, Abigail's recorded call, paper trail linking Prine to 4 victims through Ridgeline Holdings, LLC. The second list was shorter: what they didn't have. Federal action, a timeline, and any guarantee that Victor wouldn't act before the system caught up. Nash looked at the lists. In the teams, you planned for the best case and prepared for the worst. The best case was that the state AG moved quickly and the FBI task force followed. The worst case was that Victor came for Ellie before any of that happened. He folded the notebook closed and put it in the drawer. In the guest room, Storm sighed. The sound carried through the quiet house. Warm, steady, alive. Somewhere in the timber, an owl called. Nash turned off the kitchen light, but left the porch light on. The next 48 hours would decide everything. It happened on a Tuesday. Nash had driven into Pinefall at 3 in the afternoon to meet Wren at the clinic. She'd received a call from the state attorney general's office. They wanted the original medical documentation, hand-delivered, not emailed, and a notarized copy of the property records. The bureaucracy of justice moved at its own speed. Nash had learned long ago that the world divided into 2 tempos: the tempo of the people who needed help and the tempo of the people who could provide it. They almost never matched. He'd left Ellie at the ranch with Storm on watch. The new deadbolt was locked. The motion sensor was active. Before leaving, Nash had given Storm the command he used during training exercises when he needed the dog to hold position and guard a specific area. Bleib. Watch. Storm had taken his position by the guest room door and lay down, ears up, eyes on the hallway. The dog understood. Nash had drilled the command 100 times during SAR training. It meant, stay here, stay alert, and let me know if anything changes. The meeting with Wren took 90 minutes. The paperwork was detailed. Wren had organized the evidence with clinical precision. Every document labeled, dated, cross-referenced. Nash reviewed it alongside her in the upstairs office. Their shoulders were close enough over the desk that he could smell the antiseptic soap she used at the clinic. He noticed. He didn't move away. Neither did she. At 4:30, Wren signed the notarized copies. Nash packaged them for overnight courier to the AG's office. They stood in the clinic doorway and watched the courier van pull away. "That's everything we can do on paper," Wren said. "Paper's not what I'm worried about." He drove back to the ranch. The sun was low, painting the tops of the Douglas firs in amber light. The road was empty. He took the gravel turn toward his property and saw the motion sensor light was on. It shouldn't have been on. The sensor was calibrated for objects larger than a deer. It had been off when he left. Nash's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He slowed the truck to a crawl and killed the headlights. Rolled down the window. Listened. No barking. That was wrong. If someone had approached the house, Storm would have barked. Unless Storm was no longer at the house. Unless Storm was tracking. Nash parked the truck 50 yards from the house and stepped out. The air was cold, carrying the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. He moved toward the ranch on foot, keeping to the tree line, his boots silent on the pine needles. Old patterns, old muscles. 20 years of approaching structures in the dark, and his body remembered every lesson. The front door was open, not broken. Open. The deadbolt had been unlocked from the inside. Ellie would have opened it for someone she recognized, or someone who'd said the right words through the door. Nash entered the house. The kitchen was empty. The guest room door was open. Storm's water bowl was knocked sideways, a puddle spreading across the hall floor. Ellie's blanket lay on the guest room bed, folded neatly. Her shoes were gone. On the kitchen table, Ellie's GPS pendant sat in a small pool of light from the overhead fixture. The clasp was open. It had been removed, not torn off. Nash stood in the middle of his kitchen. His hands hung at his sides. The house was silent in a way that had weight. The silence of something missing. The tea kettle sat on the stove, still warm. A cup of chamomile sat on the counter, half finished. Ellie's blanket was folded on the guest room bed. She'd made the bed before leaving. Or before being taken. As though tidiness mattered. as though she'd been determined to leave behind evidence that she was a person who made her bed, who folded her blankets, who drank half a cup of tea.
Storm's water bowl was knocked sideways in the hallway. A puddle was spreading across the hardwood. Nash reconstructed the sequence. Victor had come to the door. Ellie had opened it, because she would have. Because despite everything, Victor was her daughter's husband, and the part of Ellie that still believed in family was stronger than the part that had learned to fear it. Victor had talked to her, convinced her, or frightened her. Storm had been in guard position, and the dog's bowl had been knocked during whatever happened in the hallway.
But Storm hadn't attacked. That meant Victor had spoken quietly, hadn't raised his hand, hadn't triggered the dog's protection drive. He'd walked Ellie out of the house with the calm of a man who had legal paperwork that said he owned her. And Ellie had removed the GPS pendant herself, because she knew Victor would find it and know Nash was tracking her. She'd left it on the table where Nash would see it, where Nash would understand.
She'd left it like a message. He took me. I'm not lost. Find me.
Nash's hands curled into fists at his sides. His right shoulder locked, the rotator cuff seizing as the muscles tensed. He stood in the kitchen and felt the house empty around him. The same emptiness that had lived here before Ellie arrived. The silence of rooms that contained furniture and nothing else. Then he heard Storm, not barking, not inside the house. A single sharp bark from outside, distant, coming from the north tree line. Then another. Then silence. Nash's vision narrowed. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, the kitchen disappeared. In its place, a concrete room. Green light from night vision, radio static, and a voice. Young, steady, trying not to be afraid. Commander, we're still inside. Do you copy? Commander, we're still...
Nash's right hand clenched. The tendons in his forearm stood rigid under the skin. His breathing stopped.
He'd given the abort order. He'd made the call based on changed intel. Threat level escalated. Extraction route compromised. The math said, pull out. The math was right. 2 of his operators were still deep in the target building. One of them made it out. The other made it out without his left leg. The math was right, and someone paid the price. And Nash had carried the receipt for 3 years. Then, wet. Cold. A pressure against his left hand. Storm's nose. The dog had come back. He stood in the kitchen doorway, panting hard, mud on his paws and chest, and he'd pushed his wet nose into Nash's palm. Not a trained behavior, not a command response. An act of pure canine instinct. The dog had felt the man leave and had come to bring him back. Nash looked down. Storm looked up. The dog's amber eyes were steady, clear, present, here, now. Not 3 years ago in a concrete room. Here, in a kitchen in Pinefall with a knocked-over water bowl and a cold cup of tea. Yeah. Nash's voice was rough. He swallowed. Yeah, I'm here. He breathed. 1 count. 2. 3. The room came back. The kitchen. The pendant on the table. The open door. Assess. Plan. Execute. He pulled out his phone and called Wren. Ellie's gone. Victor took her while I was in town. Storm has the trail. I'm going after them. Nash. Call state police. Tell them elder abduction in progress.
Suspect heading north on logging roads out of Pinefall. Victor Tate. Dark SUV, possibly armed.
I'm calling now. Nash, B. I won't lose her. He ended the call, grabbed the tactical jacket from the hook by the door, heavy canvas, inside pockets for first aid kit, flashlight, multi-tool. Stuffed a fleece blanket from the couch into his pack. Ellie would be hypothermic if she'd been outside for any length of time. Storm was already at the door. The dog's body language had shifted entirely. Alert, driven, locked onto a scent trail that led north from the driveway into the timber. His nose worked the air in short, quick draws, his ears pinned forward. Such. Storm dropped his nose and moved. Nash followed.
The forest swallowed them. October in the Pacific Northwest meant darkness came early and arrived fast. By 5:15, the light under the canopy had dimmed to a grainy twilight. The pines stood in columns around them, their trunks dark and straight, the forest floor thick with needles that muffled every footfall. Nash's flashlight cut a narrow cone ahead, but he kept it angled low, enough to see the ground, not enough to signal his position. Storm tracked with discipline. Nose down, steady pace, stopping every 100 yards to lift his head and test the air before dropping back to the ground trail. The dog's training held. This was what Nash had built him for, not mannequins in a field, not cotton pads in boxes. This. Nash moved behind Storm with the controlled efficiency of 2 decades of field work. He kept his breathing regulated. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. The way he'd trained in Coronado and never forgotten. His eyes swept in constant rotation. Ground for obstacles, middle distance for movement, canopy line for orientation. Every 200 yards, he checked his compass bearing against Storm's heading. Northeast. Consistent. Victor was heading for the county highway that connected to the interstate 12 miles north. At the 15-minute mark, Nash found tire tracks where a forest road crossed a muddy drainage. SUV tread. Recent. The water hadn't fully pooled in the impressions. He knelt and pressed 2 fingers into the nearest track. Soft edges, minimal erosion, less than 90 minutes old. They were closing. Storm paused at the tracks, sniffed once, then continued past. The dog wasn't tracking the vehicle. He was tracking Ellie. Her scent was his mission. The terrain sloped downward. Nash shortened his stride on the descent, leading with his right leg, managing the grade the way he'd managed worse terrain in worse weather. Not ideal for speed, adequate for distance. He'd covered harder ground in worse conditions with heavier loads. Nash checked his phone. No signal. The timber was too dense and the terrain too low. Wren would have called state police by now. But there were dozens of logging roads branching off the main highway, most unmarked. The police would be searching blind. Nash had Storm. That was the difference. Rain started. Not the steady drizzle that had been Pinefall's default all week, but a harder rain driven by wind from the southwest. It hit the canopy first, then filtered through in fat drops that struck Nash's jacket and ran down his neck. The temperature was dropping. He estimated low 40s and falling. Storm didn't slow. The rain was a problem for human trackers. It degraded scent, washed away ground sign. But Storm was working a combination of ground and air scent, and the trail was fresh. Less than 2 hours old. The dog moved with the certainty of an animal locked onto something real. 40 minutes in, the forest opened slightly.
The pines thinned into a stretch of second-growth timber with alder and maple mixed in. A creek ran through a shallow ravine to the east, its water high and fast from the week's rain. Beyond it, Nash could see the pale line of a logging road.
Storm stopped. His body went rigid, tail straight back, ears forward. He stared through the trees at the logging road. Nash dropped to a crouch beside the dog. Platz. Storm lay down. His chin rested on his paws, but every muscle in his body was live. Nash killed the flashlight. Let his eyes adjust. Through the rain and the trees, he could make out a shape on the logging road. A vehicle. Dark-colored. Lights on. He moved forward, alone. Used the tree trunks for cover, the way he'd used concrete barriers and building corners in a dozen countries. Controlled breathing. Quiet feet. One position to the next, always with cover behind him and a line of retreat mapped in his head. The vehicle was an SUV, dark blue or black, hard to tell in the failing light. Washington plates. Engine running, exhaust curling white in the cold air. The driver's door was open. Victor Tate stood at the rear of the SUV, trying to help Ellie out of the back seat. Ellie was resisting, not fighting. Her body didn't have the strength for that. She was simply not cooperating. Dead weight, refusing to put her feet on the ground. Victor's hands were under her arms, pulling, frustrated. Nash assessed. Victor was not a trained combatant. His movements were clumsy, agitated. He kept looking over his shoulder, back down the logging road, into the trees. Scared. A man running out of options and running out of time. Then Nash saw the shotgun. It leaned against the rear bumper of the SUV, within Victor's reach. A pump action, older model. Nash cataloged it automatically. 12 gauge, probably loaded. Safety likely off, given Victor's state of mind. Effective range for buckshot, 40 yards. Nash was at 60. He needed to close the distance. But he needed Victor's attention away from the weapon. From behind him, a sound. Not Storm. Nash had left the dog in position. Something else. A voice. You can take my house. Ellie's voice carried through the rain, thin but clear. She'd stopped resisting and was looking up at Victor from the back seat. You can take my name. You can take every dollar I ever saved. But you cannot take the fact that God sees what you're doing, Victor. Every night, every lock, every lie you told my daughter. Victor released her arms. He stepped back. His face, Nash could see it now in the dome light from the SUV, was not the face of a predator. It was the face of a man who'd walked into a hole so deep he couldn't see the sky anymore. Nash breathed. In the darkness, unseen, he closed his eyes for 1 second. Let me get this right. He stepped out of the trees. Victor saw him and grabbed the shotgun. Stay back. Nash stopped. 10 yards. He held both hands open at his sides, palms visible. No weapon, no flashlight. Just a man standing in the rain. Victor, put it down. Victor raised the shotgun. The barrel trembled. His finger was outside the trigger guard, a detail Nash noted and filed. Scared enough to point a weapon, not angry enough to fire it. You're not a killer. You're a man in a hole he dug himself. You don't know anything about me. I know about your wife, Abigail. MS, stage 2. I know about the medical bills that Medicare doesn't cover. I know Garrett Prime told you this was the only way to keep your family afloat.
Nash kept his voice even, the cadence he'd used in hundreds of briefings. Clear, deliberate, carrying authority without volume.
And I know you believed him, because the alternative was watching the woman you love lose everything, while you stood there with empty hands.
Victor's face changed. The shotgun dipped an inch.
How do you?
Because I've spent 20 years reading people who are about to make the worst decision of their lives. And you're about to make yours. Nash took one step forward. Right now, this is fraud and false imprisonment. Prine will take the federal charges. You'll face state charges, but a judge will consider Abigail's condition, the financial pressure, the fact that you cooperated. Another step. But if you drive away tonight with that woman in your car, it becomes kidnapping. Interstate flight. That's federal. That's mandatory minimum. And Abigail will be alone. Victor's arms shook. The shotgun barrel moved in small circles. Rain ran down the stock and dripped from the trigger guard. Ellie spoke from the back seat. Her voice was quiet and steady. The voice of a woman who had spent 91 days in a locked cabin and come out with something unbroken. Victor, I never hated you. I hated what you chose. She paused. My daughter loves you. I don't understand why, but she does. And if you put that down right now, you might still deserve it. Victor looked at Ellie. Really looked. Maybe for the first time since the guardianship papers were signed. He saw what Nash had seen the night he'd broken into the cabin. Clear eyes, sharp mind. A woman who was fully present and fully aware of every wrong that had been done to her. Not fear in those eyes. Sadness. The shotgun lowered. Victor's arms dropped. The weapon hung at his side, barrel toward the mud. Nash crossed the remaining distance in 3 strides. He took the shotgun from Victor's hands. Firm, smooth. The way you take a weapon from someone who's decided to let go. He cleared the chamber, pumped the action twice, set it on the roof of the SUV. Victor sank to his knees on the wet road. His hands covered his face. Behind Nash, a sound. Pause on gravel. Storm appeared from the tree line. Nash hadn't called him. The dog had broken the Platts command on his own. The second time in a week he'd overridden training with instinct. He walked past Victor without glancing at the man. He went straight to the SUV, jumped onto the back seat beside Ellie, and lay down with his head on her lap. Ellie's hand settled on his fur. There you are. Headlights appeared at the far end of the logging road. Then red and blue flashers. 2 vehicles. State police. Nash stood in the rain between a kneeling man and an open SUV, his hands empty, his breathing steady. The lights washed over him, red, blue, painting the trees in alternating color. He didn't move until the officers reached them. Then he identified himself, explained the situation in precise, chronological terms, and stepped aside. The system would take it from here. Nash had done his part. He climbed into the back of the SUV and sat beside Ellie. Storm lay across both their laps. Nash pulled the fleece blanket from his pack and draped it over Ellie's shoulders. She was shivering. Mild hypothermia from the cold and rain. Nash put his arm across the blanket, holding it against her back. Not an embrace, thermal management. But Ellie leaned into the warmth, and he didn't pull away. I knew you'd come, she said. Her voice was thin, but clear. Storm came. I just followed. Liar. Storm's tail thumped. Nash almost smiled. Outside, the officers were putting Victor in the back of a patrol car. Victor went quietly. He didn't look at the SUV. He didn't look at anything. He sat in the back seat with his hands cuffed in front of him and stared at the floor. And Nash thought about a word Ellie had used. Chose. Victor had chosen this. Every step, every lock, every lie. And now, the choosing was done. Wren arrived 20 minutes after the state police. She'd driven the logging roads in the dark with her high beams on and her hands tight on the wheel. When she stepped out of the Subaru and saw Nash sitting in the back of the SUV with Ellie and Storm, something in her posture changed. A release, subtle, like a breath held too long finally leaving the body. She went to work immediately, blood pressure cuff on Ellie's arm, pulse ox on her finger, penlight in her eyes. Wren's hands were steady, her voice professional, but her jaw was set in the way Nash recognized from the clinic, the set of a woman who would not lose another patient. Not tonight. Not ever again, if she could help it. Mild hypothermia, 96.2. We need to warm her gradually. Wren looked at Nash. How long was she outside? I estimate 90 minutes to 2 hours. Wren pulled a mylar blanket from her kit and layered it over the fleece. She turned the SUV's heater to maximum and positioned the vents toward Ellie. Nash shifted to give Wren room to work. As he leaned forward, his jacket pulled open. The thermal beneath had ridden up on one side. Wren glanced down. The scar, 4 inches along his left ribcage. A pale ridge of tissue, smooth at the center, ragged at the edges. Shrapnel. The kind of scar that told a story without words. Entry angle, velocity, the fact that whatever had made it had passed close enough to kill and chosen not to. Wren saw it. Her hands paused for half a second. Then she continued adjusting the blanket on Ellie's shoulders. She didn't ask. Nash didn't explain. There was a language between people who had served, a grammar of scars and silences, and the things you learned not to say out loud. Wren spoke it fluently. Ellie's temperature rose to 97 within the hour. The shivering slowed. Color returned to her face. Storm never left her lap. A state police officer drove them back to Pinefall in the SUV. Nash sat in front. Wren sat in back with Ellie and Storm. Through the rearview mirror, Nash could see Wren's hand resting on the seat between her and Ellie. Close to the old woman, but not touching. Available. That was Wren's way. She didn't impose care. She offered proximity and let people close the distance themselves. At the clinic, Wren settled Ellie on the exam table for a full assessment. Nash waited in the hallway. Storm sat beside him, pressed against his leg, watching the exam room door. Nash pulled out his phone. 3 missed calls from his federal contact. 1 from Abigail. He called Abigail first. She answered on the first ring. Is she alive? She's with Wren at the clinic. She's safe. Hypothermic, but stable. A sound on the line that might have been crying or might have been relief. Sometimes they sounded the same. Can I come? I'll send someone to pick you up. Nash hung up and called Mrs. Hargrove. The neighbor answered in a voice thick with sleep and immediately said she'd drive to the motel. Small town, short distances, fast action when it mattered. Abigail arrived at the clinic 40 minutes later. Wren met her at the door and walked her to the exam room. Nash stayed in the hallway. This wasn't his moment. Through the closed door, he heard Abigail's voice. "Mom, I'm so sorry. You didn't know, sweetheart. I should have known. I should have visited. I should have called that facility myself months ago instead of believing."
Abigail. Ellie's voice cut through the spiral with quiet authority. "You are here, right now. That's what matters. I'm not leaving again."
"I know." Storm whined softly at Nash's feet. Nash reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears. "Easy." After a while, the door opened. Wren stepped out and closed it behind her. She leaned against the wall beside Nash. They stood in the narrow clinic hallway, fluorescent light humming above them, the muffled sound of mother and daughter talking through the door. "She'll be fine," Wren said. "Physically. The rest will take longer." "It always does." Wren nodded. She looked at her hands. They were still. She turned them over, examining the palms as though seeing them for the first time. "3 years ago, I let a woman down. Tonight, I didn't." She looked at Nash. "That doesn't erase the first one, but it changes what comes next." Nash understood that arithmetic. The debts you carry don't disappear. You just learn to carry new things alongside them. Things that have weight of a different kind. "Yeah, it does." They stood in the hallway for another minute. Storm lay between them, his breathing slow and even, his body warm against both their ankles. The days after moved at a different pace. State police took Victor into custody. He cooperated fully, gave a statement naming Garrett Prine as the architect of the guardianship scheme, and identifying 2 other families Prine had targeted through the same playbook. The FBI task force out of Portland opened a formal investigation within 72 hours. Prine's office was raided on a Thursday morning. Nash heard about it from his federal contact in a 2-sentence phone call. "We got Prine. 4 victims confirmed. Your evidence was the tipping point." Copy. That was all Nash needed. Abigail visited her mother every day. She'd moved from the motel to a rented room above the hardware store. The owner's wife had offered it when word spread about what had happened. Small towns had long memories. They also had short distances between outrage and action. Within a week, 3 other residents had called Wren's clinic, asking how to check on elderly relatives they hadn't heard from in a while. Ellie stayed with the woman Nash had met outside her old house. The neighbor, Mrs. Hargrove, the one who'd said, "It kept me up at night." She'd been the one who'd eventually called Wren's clinic with an anonymous tip 3 days before Storm found the cabin. Nash only learned that detail later. The call hadn't led to action in time, but it meant the town hadn't been entirely silent. One person had tried. Wren filed the paperwork to have Ellie's guardianship revoked. The process would take weeks, but with the medical evidence, the recorded phone call, and Victor's cooperation, the outcome was not in doubt. Ellie would be free. Legally. Officially. On paper. The same paper that had trapped her. On the 8th morning after the logging road, Nash sat on the back porch at dawn. The October air was sharp, carrying the first real cold of the approaching season. Frost edged the grass at the tree line. The pines were still. Storm lay beside his chair, nose resting on his front paws. The dog had been calmer since that night. Something in his energy had settled, not less alert, but more grounded. He'd completed his first real search and rescue. He'd found a person who needed finding. The training had become purpose, and the purpose had become peace. Nash's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. A number he recognized. He'd been expecting this call for 8 days, and dreading it for 3 years, he answered. Calloway. The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Derek Foley, former operator, Nash's platoon, the last deployment. Derek was the one who'd gone deep during the mission Nash had ordered aborted. Derek was the one who'd lost his left leg below the knee when the extraction window collapsed. "Heard you've been busy up there in the woods, Commander." Derek's voice was the same, dry, unhurried, carrying the kind of humor that only survived in men who'd been through things most people couldn't imagine. Nash closed his eyes. "News travels. Always does in the community. You know that." A pause, then quieter. "For what it's worth, Nash, I never blamed you. The call was right. The intel changed. You pulled the trigger on abort because that's what the situation demanded." Nash's jaw worked. He stared at the frost on the grass. Storm's ears had rotated toward the phone, tracking the voice. The cost. The cost was what it was. That's not on you. That's on the op. That's on the enemy. That's on the universe or God or whatever you want to call the thing that decides who walks out and who doesn't. Derek paused. "I walked out, Nash. Different than I walked in, but I walked out. And I've spent 3 years waiting for you to pick up the phone and let me say that." Nash's hand rested on Storm's head. The dog pressed into his palm. "I'm sorry," Nash said. The words were inadequate. They'd always been inadequate. But they were the ones he had. "I know, brother. Now stop carrying it." The call ended. Nash set the phone on the arm of the chair. He sat there for a long time, his hand on Storm's head, watching the frost melt as the sun rose over the pines. He didn't feel healed. That wasn't how it worked. Not in his experience. Not for men who'd spent their lives in rooms where the stakes were measured in lives. Healing wasn't a moment. It was a direction. And for the first time in 3 years, the direction had shifted. Storm sighed beneath his hand. The sound was warm, alive. Enough. The town hall potluck was Carolyn's idea. The waitress from the Pine Box had organized it in 4 days flat, calling in favors from the grocery, the church women's group, and a caterer from the next town over who owed her a favor from a disputed pie recipe. The event was framed as a community dinner. No agenda, no speeches. Just food and the quiet understanding that something had happened in Pinefall that required people to be in the same room together. The hall was a converted Grange building with high ceilings, long folding tables, and fluorescent lights that turned everyone slightly green. Someone had strung Christmas lights along the rafters to counter the effect. It helped. Ellie sat at the center of the longest table, flanked by Mrs. Hargrove on one side and Abigail on the other. Abigail's cane leaned against the table leg. She looked tired but steady. She'd started physical therapy at Wren's clinic 3 days earlier, a decision that Wren had suggested, and Abigail had accepted with the quiet determination of a woman rebuilding her life, one appointment at a time. Wren stood at the far end of the hall, talking to the postmaster, Loomis. From the way Loomis kept shifting his weight and touching his collar, Nash guessed the conversation involved the mail hold and a measure of belated guilt. Wren's expression was professional, not unkind, but direct. She'd stopped apologizing for asking hard questions. Nash stood near the wall, a cup of apple cider in his hand, his back against the brick. He could see the room's 2 exits, the kitchen door, and most of the tables. Habit. But tonight, the scanning had a different quality. He wasn't looking for threats. He was looking at people. The old man from the library bench sat near the door, eating potato salad and telling a story that was making two younger women laugh. The neighbor from Ellie's old street, the woman who'd said, "Was I wrong?" sat across from Abigail, passing a bowl of cornbread. Carolyn moved between tables with a coffee pot, refilling cups and accepting compliments on the coleslaw she'd made at 4 a.m. Pinefall. A town that had let an old woman disappear, and a town that, when it finally understood what had happened, had set long tables and strung Christmas lights and made enough food for 200 people, because that was what you did. You showed up. You fed each other. You started again. Storm lay under the table near Ellie's feet. The dog had been calm all evening, none of the hypervigilance that usually marked him in crowds. His tail moved periodically, usually when someone dropped food. A man 3 chairs down lost a piece of fried chicken to an opportunistic nose, and Storm carried it under the table with the dignified satisfaction of a dog who had earned his comforts. Ellie caught Nash's eye from across the room. She smiled, small, real, and gave a single nod. Nash returned it. No words, but the nod carried everything it needed to. Thank you. Not just for the rescue, for choosing to answer the door when my knocking came through your dog. Nash took a sip of cider. It was too sweet. He drank it anyway. The next morning was a Tuesday. Nash was in the south field at 7, setting up a tracking exercise for Storm. The air was cold and clean, an October morning where the sky looked scrubbed and the frost on the grass made everything sharp-edged. Storm ran the perimeter of the field in a wide loop, burning energy, his breath making small clouds that vanished in the sunlight. Nash stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched the dog run. His body carried the week's work in places he didn't bother cataloging anymore. He stretched his neck once, didn't stretch it again. There were limits to how much attention he was willing to give old injuries on a morning like this. The ranch looked different to him now. Not the acreage, not the buildings. Those were the same. But the quality of the light had changed. Or maybe the quality of his scene had changed. The barn where he'd trained Storm 1,000 times. The porch where Ellie had prayed. The guest room where a dog had chosen to guard a stranger because the stranger needed guarding. The kitchen where he'd stood frozen for 3 seconds and been brought back by a wet nose. 18 months he'd lived here. It had taken a dog, an old woman, and a doctor with her own ghosts to make the place feel like something more than a property. Storm completed his loop and circled back, panting, tail up. Nash pulled a tennis ball from his pocket and threw it across the field. Storm launched after it. The ball bounced twice. The dog caught it on the third bounce, mid-air, and brought it back at a dead sprint. Show off. Storm dropped the ball at Nash's feet and sat, tongue out, waiting. Nash heard a car. He turned. Ren's Subaru rolled up the gravel drive and parked beside his truck. The engine cut. The door opened. Ren stepped out. She wore jeans, a fleece, and hiking boots instead of her usual scrubs. A Labrador Retriever, golden, 2 years old, all tongue and enthusiasm, bounded out of the back seat and immediately began investigating every square inch of the driveway. Storm stopped his perimeter run. His head came up. He studied the Labrador with the measured attention of a professional assessing a new colleague. The lab galloped toward Storm. Storm stood his ground, sniffed the lab's face once, and returned his gaze to Wren, tail moving in a slow wag. Approved. Nash walked to the driveway. Wren stood by her car, one hand on the lab's collar. You said Tuesday training resumes. Nash looked at her, looked at the Labrador, looked at Storm, who had trotted over and was now sitting beside the lab with an expression of patient tolerance. Copper. Copper. Wren let go of the collar. The lab immediately tried to eat a pine cone. He's not exactly operational. We'll work on that. Wren smiled. Brief. Real. The kind that reached her eyes and stayed there longer than the ones before it. They walked to the south field together. Nash explained the tracking drill. Scent pad hidden in a brush pile. Wind direction. Approach angle. Wren listened the way she listened to everything. Carefully. Asking one question at a time. Storing the answers. Storm ran the exercise first. Nose down, steady, a straight line to the target. He sat, looked back, waited for the reward. Perfect. Copper ran the exercise second. He found the brush pile, missed the scent pad, chased a squirrel, returned to Wren covered in mud, and sat on her foot with an expression of absolute self-satisfaction. Nash looked at Wren. Wren looked at Nash. He needs work, she said. He needs Tuesdays. Wren held his gaze. The morning light caught the side of her face, the line of her jaw, the small scar near her left eyebrow that Nash had never noticed before. She didn't look away. Then I'll be here on Tuesdays. No more than that. No declarations. No promises wrapped in words too large for the space between them. Just two people who had served in the same branch, carried similar weight, and found themselves standing in the same field on a clear October morning, with two dogs, and the understanding that this was a beginning. Storm sat beside Nash. Copper sat beside Wren. The four of them faced the south field, where the sun was burning the last of the frost off the grass, and the pines at the far edge stood green and tall and patient. Nash thought about a dog who'd broken a command to run into the dark. About an old woman who'd knocked on a door for 91 days. About a daughter who'd recorded her husband's lies with shaking hands. About a man on a logging road who'd lowered a weapon because a 70-year-old woman looked at him and said, "I never hated you." He thought about a porch light he'd left on. Storm leaned against Nash's leg. The dog's weight was warm and solid and real. "Good boy," Nash said. Storm's tail moved once. That was enough. It had always been enough.